This video is about doing a Crown Victoria front suspension swap on a 1964 Ford Galaxie 500. Hi. As far as I know, this project is somewhat unusual. Up to now, I haven't seen anyone do a Crown Vic front suspension swap on an early 60s full-size Ford car, so I thought it was worth telling the story. My name is Guy Casey from Rogersville, New Brunswick, in Canada. I've owned this car since 1986. Over a 6-year span, from 1988 till 1994, it had a frame-off restoration at a collision repair shop I was operating at that time. Fast forward 18 years to 2012, and after being driven 23,000 miles, it needed suspension, brakes, and drivetrain repairs. Since I never really cared for the feel of the steering and for the way that it handled, I decided to make a major overhaul to it. I had been meaning to replace the drum brakes with disc brakes for the longest time, but hadn't gotten around to it. After being motivated by several TV shows and hot rod shops on YouTube who were making modifications to old cars, I decided to start on a project on my classic car. This was a big job, but I'm not one who gives up easily, so I pushed through, and eventually completed the project. In order to be able to do this kind of job, you need a certain knowledge that comes from experience in this kind of work. Being a certified auto body and painter technician allowed me to be able to fabricate and properly reinforce the front frame on this car, which had to be sectioned and modified to allow the front suspension from the Crown Vic to bolt to it. So, I bought a 2009 Ford Crown Victoria, the donor car, and started the project. First thing was to strip down the donor car. I had a plan to do more than just the front suspension swap, so as I was taking the Crown Vic apart, I chose which mechanical and electrical parts that I was going to incorporate into the project. Labeling everything at this point was very helpful for later on in the project. At this point, I made all the critical measurements, comparing the frame on the donor car to the frame on my 64 Galaxie. As you can see from the photos, there are a lot of differences in the two frame configurations. I had to decide how much of the donor car frame I was going to need. I also had to decide how much of the 64 Galaxie frame I was going to have to cut out and discard. Basically, the whole outlined area had to go. The parts required off the donor car were the front suspension crossmember assembly and both front frame sections. Before cutting the donor car's frame, I made 2 plywood templates that bolt to the top side and the underside of the frame, at the area where the suspension crossmember bolts to the frame. These are critical measurements, that will be used to align the new sections into the frame graft, before welding begins on the 64 Galaxie. Initial cuts to the donor car frame were made. These are the parts to be used in the swap. Before cutting the Galaxie frame, the entire frame was leveled lengthwise and side to side and the car was jigged 18 inches off the floor. Starting with a leveled frame meant that I could then use a level to adjust the grafted pieces, as I was confirming the measurements before welding begins. Jigs were also placed underneath the front section and the front sheet metal and bumper were kept in place for panel alignment purposes. Initial cuts to the 64 Galaxie frame were made. If I had second thoughts about doing this swap, it's too late to change my mind now. All cut areas were trimmed to create offset cuts in all the joint areas. This makes for stronger sectioned areas. Here we can see the precisely cut wooden jigs I used. Here are the jigs underneath the frame front section, and the front bumper. As I was preparing each offset cut, I made cutline templates that can be used in the future for a similar project on a 1960 to 1964 Ford full-size car. The templates have aligning holes with holes in the frame. In order to be able to reinforce all but welded areas where the frame was being sectioned, the Crown Vic frame had to be opened up in 2 clamshell halves. Once trimmed and fitted, the frame sections were cleaned and primed with epoxy primer. All the weld areas were primed with a weld-through primer. These are all the fabricated inserts and/or gussets that were welded at each joint area to make the frame crash-worthy. All of these are in the inside of the boxed frame. The inserts and gussets are laying on a peg board. For your reference, it is 1-inch hole to hole. A notch had to be created in the inner sidewall of the lower part of the frame on both sides to allow the tail end of the lower control arms to fit properly. A pattern or template was made to build the two frame sections needed to tie together the grafted pieces to the frame. This fabricated section will be welded in that notch created in the frame. These two frame sections were fabricated with 1/4 inch by 3-inch flat bar. They tie together the donor car frame to the Galaxie frame. Because there is no other way to bring the two pieces in tight together, where the fabricated section goes into the frame rail, the two front plug weld holes were drilled and tapped so that I could bolt the section in tight to the inside of the frame to ensure a tight fit between the two pieces. Once the piece was spot welded in, the bolts were removed, and these holes were partially re-drilled and plug welded. Because I was plug welding in 1/4 inch thick steel, the plug weld areas were pre-drilled in 3 stages to assure proper weld penetration. As you can well imagine, all the plug welds on the underside of the frame rails had to be done in the overhead position. Pre-drilling helps assure weld penetration in this position. The pieces are laying on a 1-inch square pegboard. With the fabricated section mounted in place, you can see the tight fit of the two frame members to be plug welded. Plug weld areas were marked then pre-drilled, as previously explained, to assure weld penetration. The lower control arm rear bushing bracket had to be realigned to true horizontal in order to work for this application. The mounting brackets were cut off the bushing outer sleeves and re-welded in the true horizontal position. On the bottom photo you can see the original position of the pivot bushing brackets. And on the upper photo you can see the corrected position. The outer bolt tab on the bracket had to be cut off for proper fit. To adjust the grafted sections, I used those 2 plywood templates. This confirmed proper alignment of my front frame before any spot welds were laid. As previously mentioned, these templates were built on the donor car's frame before it was cut. This is how the 2 fabricated sections fit into the notches at the back of both lower control arms. Time for a dry fit. With the outer clamshell sections of the frame spot welded in, I could confirm that all the measurements are accurate. At this point, I fabricated and fitted all the reinforcing inserts and/or gussets for each butt joint area. Once these were done, the spot welds were cut and everything was taken apart. All the inserts and/or gussets, for which I didn't have access with the outer clamshell frame on, were welded in place. It is worth noting here, that since I used unibody sectioning techniques to section the frame, which has much thicker metal than a unibody structure, I am pre-drilling the inserts in all the plug weld areas to assure optimum weld penetration and strength. Looking at the back side of the plug weld areas, I could confirm that I had weld penetration right through the insert. All the butt areas of the frame sections had the appropriate root gaps, and all were completely welded. All the lap joint areas were also completely welded. To avoid heat distortion and warpage, alternating stitch welding technique was used. With the outer clamshell frame sections and all the inserts and reinforcements welded in. Then the inner clamshell sections were trimmed to fit. And these were welded in. I had to fabricate and weld in small closeout panels to fill in some gaps caused by different configurations of the frame members. These closeout panels are purely for aesthetics and have very little structural values. The lower portion of the body mount had to be trimmed away for welding access. A piece was then fabricated and welded in. As previously mentioned, all of the frame modifications were done with the front clip and front bumper on. This was done to assure proper fit of front body panels. The front clip was then removed to prime and paint the frame. I also rust-proofed the inside of the frame at this point. I cleaned and painted what was required on the crossmember and suspension assembly and insulated the aluminum crossmember from the steel frame to prevent future galvanic corrosion. I installed the suspension assembly for the last time. That was a milestone. The front track width of the Crown Vic is wider than that of the Galaxie. To match the rear wheels with the front track width, I moved the rear wheels outwards, by installing 1.5-inch spacers between the axles and rear wheels on both sides. When making this kind of modification, the suspension assembly had to be raised up in place and tried several times. There was also a lot of time spent measuring for 3 dimensions, cutting, trimming, and fitting everything. The drivetrain was then installed and all the work that needed to be done with the front panels off was completed. Finally, the front clip reinstalled, and the other parts of the job were finished. Should anyone want to do this modification to their early 60s full-size Ford, send me an email. I can sell you a full template set that will show you where to cut your frame and how deep to cut into your frame. I'll also include instructions, in the form of a plan, to save you a lot of time and unknowns. This modification must be done by someone who knows what they are doing, as far as measuring a vehicle frame, welding, and all other aspects of structural sectioning. The templates and plan will be helpful to the person doing the work. But I don't claim that this is all you need. When purchasing this template set and plan, you will equip yourself with a valuable and beneficial tool. You won't have to figure out and calculate everything. All the fitting that I've had to do to get the frame sections to fit right will be in your hands. Through all the hours of modifying and fitting, I made some mistakes that cost me time and I had to refigure things out. With my plan and templates, you can potentially eliminate the same mistakes I made. You will see everything through all the photos to back up each topic. However, you will be responsible for undertaking the project. You will still have to fit each and every piece of the puzzle and fabricate some as well. Here are some topics covered in the plan. How to use the templates. Specific instructions and steps to follow. The importance of 3-dimensional measurements. Establishing your datum line and true level. Important notes. The importance of precision cuts. Frame strengthening techniques. And all the welding tips and information you'll need for structural welding. I also explain how to use electrolysis, rust removal for any rusted parts you need to use. Here are the templates for the left side of the Galaxie frame. This is a sample of the information provided on the templates. These are the templates for the Crown Vic frame sections. I've driven the car 4,200 kilometers, 2,625 miles, since I've finished my project. The car steers, handles, and stops like a new car. Compared to what it used to be, I can't get over how much I enjoy driving it now. In the future, I'll post more videos of the other modifications that were done to this car. For information about the plan for this modification, email me at the address on the screen. Thanks for watching and have a great day.